Nancy, thank you so much for joining the Girl Defined show. I'm so excited to have you here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. And I'm glad Dave can be here today, too.
Yes. Got to bring the man's perspective.
I've been looking forward to this.
Okay, so the term toxic masculinity, like we have all heard that. It has been flying around absolutely everywhere. But you decided to write a book called The Toxic War on Masculinity. Can you just share why you decided to write this book and what your hope is it will accomplish?
Yeah, well, for starters, it's just what you said. I was pretty taken aback by some of the overt hostility that it's now become acceptable to express. The Washington Post, mainstream newspaper, had an article called, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, what? Or the Huffington Post had an article where the editor said her favorite hashtag was "Kill All Men." You can buy T-shirts now that say "So many men, so little ammunition," and even books, and even books with titles like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men" and "Are Men Necessary?" And I thought, I really would like to get to the bottom of this. Where is this coming from? And many people think, well, maybe it's second wave feminism in the 1960s, but it actually goes much further back, and we won't deal with it effectively unless we know where it came from and how it developed. So, and let me give you a few more quotes. So many men are even jumping on the bandwagon. You might have seen this. The director of the movie Avatar. This came out just, weeks ago, where he said testosterone is a toxin. You have to work it out of your system. And a male author writes, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So I thought, wow, we've got to explain this if we want to try to counter it and help men stand against that kind of denigration. I read a psychologist or psychiatrist, I don't remember. She writes for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, I'm getting more and more young men in my practice who feel defeated and beaten down because they're growing up in a culture that's so hostile to masculinity. So certainly that was the first reason I wanted to write the book was, where's this coming from? And how can we help, craft a better Christian answer?
Yeah, exactly. I know. I mean, we have a son, a 3-year-old, and you look out and you're like, wow, the world is just so crazy. But then there are people like you writing books like this, helping to reframe all of the craziness and help us specifically as Christians, know, even as parents, how can we raise our son well in this crazy world? And so I just appreciate that. I think it's going to be very helpful for us as parents over the next, many years.
And the irony is the boys are actually doing worse today. That's the other side of the coin. They're being attacked in the public arena, but they're falling behind in all areas of education, from kindergarten all the way to college. Boys are falling behind. The typical college now is 60% women, 40% men. They're falling behind in graduate school. They're falling behind even in professional schools like law and medicine. And of course, once they are men are falling behind in terms of suicide rates going up, in terms of violence, both victims and perpetrators of violence. 90% of people in prison are male. They're more likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol. They're falling out of the workplace. We are at Depression-era levels of employment among men. Wow. And most people don't know that because they're not even looking for work anymore, so they don't show up on the normal statistics. But Depression-era levels. And their life expectancy is going down. Women's is staying the same. But male life expectancy has actually gone down in the last several years. So this is, they're attacked on one side, and on the other side, they're actually doing worse. They need more support right now. From kindergarten on, men need support. So how can the church offer that?
Yeah. And it's so interesting because, women attacking men and men too, attacking themselves, saying testosterone, it's a cancer, all of that. But at the same time, you hear, I have seen so many women who are not even Christian listening to their podcasts, and they're asking where are the good men? Where are men who are going to rise up and care for women and be good? But then on the other hand, they're like, you're the worst. It's just, it makes absolutely no sense. They want two things at the same time that just can't go together.
Well, this is let me tell you about a really interesting study by a sociologist that kind of captures this. Um, I should tell you that this has been the most controversial book I've ever written, to my
Really?
surprise. Because, my last book was on things like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism.
You would think
The,
that would be it.
the book Love Thy Body.
Yeah, Love Thy Body is so good.
Oh, thank you. And it turns out that this one has been more controversial. I ran a class on it, and when my students would talk to their family and friends, invariably the first question was, "Well, whose side is she on?" Just like that, very hostile. Whose side is she on?
Women? Are you on?
Yeah. Am I?
Men's side or women's side? Yeah.
Yeah. Am I a raging feminist attacking man, or am I reactionary, angry, conservative?
Right.
And this, and by the way, the next question would be, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway? So I found. Go ahead. So I found that I had to disarm the critics in my first chapter. I rewrote this first chapter multiple times. And what helped the most was I had a study from a non-Christian sociologist. He's very well known in his field, and so he gets invited to speak all around the world. And when he does that, he asks young men 2 questions, all the way from Australia, to Austria, to Ecuador. He asks these 2 questions. And the first one is, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy they say, he was a good man, what does that mean? And they had no trouble answering. In every culture, they would say things like, I have my notes, so I'm actually going to read this to you. Honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy. I like that one. Be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. I mean, all around the world, men are made in God's image, right? So they know what it means to be a good man.
Yeah.
There was another study, by the way, by an anthropologist, the first cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. And he found the same thing. He said, no matter how different they are, all cultures hold up for men what he calls the 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. Be a father, contribute to the next generation. Yeah. And then, so back to the 2 questions by the sociologist, then he would say, where did you learn that? And they would say, well, it's just in the air we breathe. And if they were from Western cultures, they would say, it's our Judeo-Christian heritage. So then he would follow up, okay, fine. You know what the good man is. What does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? Mm-hmm. And the young man would say, no, that's completely different. That's not the same thing at all. And I'll read this one to you as well. It means be tough, strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, be competitive, get rich, get laid. And so, in other words, the things we normally associate with toxic. But I would suggest for many people, when they read my book, that kind of disarmed their criticism, because they could say, you don't have to either attack or defend masculinity wholesale. We'll defend the good man, and men are made in God's image, so they know what the good man is universally. And now let's think critically about what our culture imposes on us as the real man. And so I use that as kind of a thread throughout the whole book, in fact. So how does Christianity help confirm the good man? And how has our secular culture created a secular script of the real man? Mm-hmm. So that helps us with, like you said, Bethany, when there's, people seem to attack men and then say, how come there's no good men? Well, it's because they're going back and forth between these 2 scripts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because on the one hand, you do have that toxic masculinity label being used. And then on the other hand, like you were mentioning earlier, it's redundant for a lot of people to say toxic and masculine, like the quote about it being a cancer. Masculine is toxic, the less masculine, the better. Or like you mentioned, James Cameron, I've noticed there's a lot of us guys either grew up in a home where he had a very strong male presence that we would consider perhaps now to be overbearing, too patriarchal, very much, all about the family submitting to him, or he grew up in a culture like that. And a lot of us guys reacting to that we're sort of swinging to try to say, okay, I can see how there have been toxic components to what it means to be a man. And so now we're kind of out to sea trying to figure out, well, what are we supposed to be? And largely a lot of us are looking in the wrong places by basically saying, okay, I'm not going to be toxic like my dad or like the men that I've seen or the men that are talked about in our society. I'm going to be the right kind of guy. And so we assume that means becoming less masculine in a sense, like that we're going to become less of the real man, which almost means we're becoming more stereotypically feminine, sensitive. We're like the nice guy. And the nice guy is also selfish in a lot of ways. He's trying to, rather than gaining his sense of manhood from like, I'm going to be a real man, he's looking at women and saying, how can I get laid? How can I get women to want me? How can I? And so you hear quotes like that where men will be beating ourselves up. I think the subtext of that is men are like this except for me. Men are like this, but I'm one of the good kinds of men. I'm a man who doesn't abuse women. I do. And what we're trying to do, I think, is set ourselves up as superior to those toxic men over there. The problem with our cultural narrative, I think, is that a huge cadre of us men who have decided to go that selfish route are not getting addressed because all the voice is all about this toxic behavior. And I think standards of the good man should be applied across the board. But can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, you know what? I would like to talk about the sociological literature on Christian men, because I found that many people found this encouraging. In other words, I'm starting with the good news. The book starts with 2 chapters on the good news about Christian men, because so many people criticize Christian men, assuming that because the Bible teaches some form of headship or authority, that Christianity will lead to abuse and toxicity and dominance and so on. In fact, let's see if I can find those quotes, because I'd like to actually read them to you. Yeah, here it is. This was easy to find on the internet. You can find them with a quick search. I'll give you a few. Conservative Protestant gender ideology can clearly lead to abuse, both physical and emotional. Mm-hmm. Another one, it's no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. By the way, that was in a Christian publication. Mm-hmm. The theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So the assumption in the broader culture is that Christianity is the worst. The Christian men are like exhibit A of toxicity. Right. And I think that's part of what we're fighting against. So what I did is I looked at the literature. Sociologists listened to these criticisms and said, okay, yeah, but where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? You're making these claims without any data. So I quote, a dozen different sociologists who looked at Christian men and Christian families, Christian marriages, and what they found was the exact opposite. What they found is that compared to the average American family man, evangelical men are the most loving to their wives. And by the way, they do interview with the wives separately.
Yeah. That's funny.
Babe.
What do you actually think?
So they're really reporting on what the wives say. The wives say that they are the happiest with their husband's expression of love and appreciation. Evangelical fathers are also the most engaged fathers. They spend more time both in shared activities with their kids, like church youth group and sports, and also in discipline, like setting screen time, enforcing bedtime, and so on. They also are the least likely to divorce. They have the lowest rate of divorce of any group in America. And here, the real stunner, they have the lowest rates of domestic violence of any major group in America. So it's exactly the opposite of what our culture is saying when they pile on Christian men. And I put this right at the beginning of the book because I thought, even Christians don't know this. I had to go digging into the academic sociological literature to find this. And I thought, we need to bring this out into the public. We need to let Christian men know they're actually doing very well, compared to the rest of American culture. So this is the good news. I had the good news at the back of the book when I first wrote it. And I found that as people read the progression of the secular script and how it got worse and worse over time, they got discouraged. And so one of my students said, why don't you put the good news at the beginning? Yeah. So that's what I did. I wanted to encourage Christian men. And of course, one reason they need encouragement is that we often hear that Christians divorce at the same level as non-Christians. In my research, in fact, I found that that's one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. Yeah. Well, it's not true. But here's why it gets cited. Sociologists went back to their data and they divided out the truly committed, authentic Christian men who attend church regularly from merely nominal Christian men.
Yeah.
And in America, we have a lot of cultural Christians. Mm-hmm. So these are men who, on a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, but go to church rarely, if at all, and who actually, pick up language like headship and submission, but infuse it with secular definitions of dominance and entitlement. And listen to the stats on them. They are the least loving to their wives. In other words, their wives express the lowest levels of happiness in their marriage. They're the least involved with their children. They have the highest level of divorce, higher than secular men.
Wow.
And the real shocker, they have the highest level of domestic violence, even higher than secular men.
Yeah.
So amazingly, if you put these two groups together, committed Christian men are doing much better than secular men, but nominal Christians who identify as evangelical are doing worse than secular men. So you can see why, if you put the two groups together and just say, we're doing a study of we're doing a study of evangelical men, they'll get skewed statistics. Yeah. They need to unpack these two and realize that the challenge to the church is to affirm the good Christian men that they are doing a good job, and then to reach out to the nominals and help them to realize that what they're doing is actually a very secular understanding, but they're baptizing it with Christian words, which is maybe why they're even worse than secular men, because they feel like the church is giving them permission, to be domineering and entitled and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and Nancy, you shared a little bit of your story about your own father in this book, and just in my experience with our generation of kind of like millennials who in our, I guess in San Antonio where we live, and just growing up in conservative Christian families, we were a part of some groups, IBLP, Ginger Volo, previously Duggar, she wrote a big book and she talked all about Bill Gothard and just the impact on her family that had. We were a part of a group, Vision Forum, with Doug Phillips, and, there's others, James McDonald, people who have just abused that leadership. And we've seen a lot of people kind of like reject it altogether. Like, okay, well, this what, being a Christian means, then I'm out of here. And we've seen so many people do that. But you are someone who grew up with literally a father who was not a kind man. And I just want to know, even personally, like, how did you not just go, okay, I'm rejecting all of this. If this is what like being a Christian is, or if this is what being like male and female is, I reject it all. Like, how did you get to the place you are now and be so amazing?
Oh, well, yeah, I did reject it for a while. I do start the book with the story of my own father, who was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? It was closed fist. He was punching us and kicking us, and it was severe abuse. And yet he was a regular churchgoer.
Yeah, exactly.
Every Sunday we had to be in church. And when I was about 16, halfway through high school, I started asking, well, how do we know Christianity is true?
Yeah.
I'm going to a public high school. All my books are secular. All my teachers are secular. And so I just wanted to know, how do we know it's true? Exactly. My parents couldn't answer that question. My dad was a university professor. But when I asked him, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me.
Wow.
That's it.
Yeah.
And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and all he said was, "Don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes." And I bet,
Perfect.
yeah,
Problem solved.
yeah, like you're just going to outgrow it, it's a stage. And so I did decide. I guess Christianity doesn't have any answers,
Yeah.
and I did go through several years as an agnostic, and a pretty committed agnostic in the sense that I realized if there was no God, some people still kind of drift. They stick around the church because they have the friends there or whatever. No, I want it to be, if atheism was true, there was no God, there's no meaning to life, there's no purpose, there's no foundation for ethics, there's just true for me, true for you. I realized there was not even a foundation for knowledge, because if all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of time and space, how could I hope to have any sort of universal absolute truth?
Mm-hmm.
Ridiculous. That's how I thought of it. So I was a total relativist skeptic. And my science classes turned me into a determinist because we're just complex biochemical machines anyway. So I was very steeped in non-Christian worldviews. And I also was studying philosophy because I thought, if I can't get any people to talk to me about these issues, maybe that's what the philosopher's job is, right? To talk about what is truth and how do we know it. So by the time it was through L'Abri, the ministry of Francis Schaeffer, that I first encountered apologetics. We had lived in Europe when I was a child, and so all through high school I saved my money so I could go back because I really loved it. And so by living in Europe, I kind of stumbled across L'Abri, which is in Switzerland. And that was the first time I'd found out that Christianity can actually be supported by good reasons and arguments and evidence and logic. And so that was stunning. I had no idea. I had never encountered Christians who could answer your questions, who actually knew the questions better than you did. But also so that was a big part of my life. I mean, that's how I became a Christian.
Wow.
But also at L'Abri, on staff was a psychiatric social worker. And she was there because she realized that for a lot of people, their objections to Christianity are not just intellectual. They can also be emotional, especially your relationship with your parents.
Yeah.
And she helped me to realize, I had emotional objections as well, because my intellectual objections were so foregrounded. Until I had those answered, I couldn't really think to the next level. The next level was, you were right, Bethany. I did not want to be anything like my parents. Mm-hmm. If they were Christian, I didn't want it. If that's what they stood for, I wanted to be everything, anything my parents were, I didn't want to be. So I did discover that I also had emotional issues to work through. And the emotional healing of my past, the emotional healing of those years and years of very severe physical abuse. So the psychiatric social worker was named Sheila Bird, and she was nicknamed Birdie. So Birdie helped me get started on emotional healing. So right from the beginning of my Christian life, I was not only, working intellectually on what is a Christian worldview, but also emotionally on what does it mean to have spiritual and emotional healing, psychological healing, right from the beginning of my Christian life. So it's an amazing gift. And I had a Christian psychologist interviewed me a few days ago, and he said, when I first opened your book and I read your story about your dad, I thought, oh no, another angry feminist. And then I got to the end, and I realized, actually, you've worked it through. Wow. You've come out the other side with a really rich experience of healing, of experiencing that God's love has power to heal the past, to heal the wounds that you bring into your adult world. So this book has has that balance, of the intellectual input, but also the spiritual healing.
Yeah. So what do you say to the woman who, because I know them, like I grew up and both of us did, these very conservative circles. And so when we hear like, oh, the devout Christian man, the more
Right.
like devout, then they're the ones who are having the better marriages. When we've seen these men up on stage, like I said, Bill Gothard, Doug Phillips, or, Ravi Zacharias, people like that who were actually, really abusing their power. And these fathers in these homes were kind of like copying that. And, women are saying, well, if that's what it means to be a devout Christian man, I don't want any part of that, like that's what I've seen. That's been my experience, is these men who literally were worshiped, like it's crazy when you've been there and you're like, oh my goodness, these men were just so worshiped, but were actually really awful behind the scenes. And they were telling everyone, I can remember so many of the things they told us of just, like just horrible ideas about what it actually means to be a devout Christian man. So how can we, Ginger Volo called it disentangle from that. How can we reframe that according to your book, the toxic war on masculinity? How can we address that level of devoutness in men?
Good. Yes. I would say two things. One is really becoming acquainted with the secular script, so that we're really convinced that this is a secular view. This is not biblical. This is secular. And then the other side of it is, I do have 2 chapters at the end of the book on abuse in Christian homes. My dad would not say, "Do this, I'll spank you." He'd say, "Do this, or I'll beat you." I was quite open about it. So I do have 2 chapters on abuse in Christian homes, and three levels of abuse. Just difficult marriages, emotional abuse, and physical abuse. So do sort of 3 stages. And difficult marriages are ones that may not be abusive, but can be very painful still. There's a psychologist who's done the most empirical research on abuse in marriage. He's Jewish, by the way, John Gottman. If you might know him because he's well known. Yeah, John Gottman. So he started as a mathematician. So he does these very mathematical analyses. He brings people into he calls it his love lab, where he wires them up to test their breathing rate, their heart rate, how they're sweating. He tests them for stress hormones and so on. And has a very complicated analysis of everything they say, from put downs to placating, that's all carefully coded. And he's well known for being able to predict with 93.6 accuracy whether a couple will divorce after watching them for about 20 minutes. And even when, these guys will last 7 years, these guys will last 12 years. So his analysis is really helpful for Christians. And what he found, the most surprising thing he found, is that the health of a marriage depends primarily on the man. And here's why. And he's not trying to blame or shame men. He's trying to show them how much power they have to improve their marriage, to make it work. But what he found is that women tend to reach out for connection even in unhappy marriages. Women are the ones who go to the therapist. Women are the ones who buy books on marriage. Women are the ones who read articles on the subject. Women are constantly trying to fix their marriage. And so he says, John Gottman says, so it mostly depends on whether the men respond. And he said, unfortunately, most of them don't. He said 65% of men do not respond to their wives. Here's his actual phrase. He says they do not accept influence from their wives, meaning they don't take their wives' voices. They don't listen to the wives' voices. They don't take their wives' concerns and opinions into account. They don't involve their wives in their decision making. 65%. And these are not the abusive marriages, but these are just the difficult marriages where women keep trying. They keep reaching out for affection. And men are stonewalling, and brushing them off. So I give a lot of, and then of course I give even more examples when we get into actual abuse. And again, I quote several experts on the field. Terry Real is one of my favorite psychologists. Again, not a Christian, but he specializes in difficult marriages. In fact, he won't even take you unless you've been through 3 or 4 therapists already.
Wow.
So he's their last chance, and he's so successful that he's been on Oprah and 2020 and all the big shows because he's so successful. And he too says it's usually the man who has to change. In my experience with bad marriages, usually it's the man who has to change, and not always, but the majority. And then there's a Christian psychologist named David Clark. I found him because he wrote a book called What to Do When Your Husband Says, I Don't Love You Anymore. Mm-hmm. I found this book days after my brother told his wife, I don't love you anymore. so I immediately bought the book. Yeah. But he too says, for the most part, he's like 80 to 85% of the men who come to me don't know how to meet their wives' needs, do not know what women's needs are. They think they do, he says, but they're wrong. So the consensus among psychologists tends to be that the husband has the responsibility. I mean, isn't that what God says? God says, the responsibility is on the man to lead his home, his marriage and his home. And so I think that this is confirming of the Christian view of marriage. And then the solution, you asked me, what should you do about it? Well, Matthew 18. I mean, Matthew 18 is the primary passage on what you do with conflict. You go to them privately first. If they don't listen to you, you bring a few other people in as witnesses. If they don't listen to you, you make it public, or at least in the church. So loving confrontation. And that's not easy for most women. So I do go through, for example, I go through some passages of scripture and explain better what they mean, which might be helpful. The two words that are often used against women are in Genesis, women were created to be the help, a help. And, in our day, we think that means like this, we use it for servants, right? The help.
Daddy's little helper.
Like the little assistant, the man does the really important work and you're his little assistant. But as you may know, in the Hebrew, the word is E-Z-E-R, it's pronounced Ezer, and it's used most often of God. In the Old Testament, it's used of God most frequently, like, our ever-present help in trouble. And it's even used in some men's names, like Ebenezer. Now, Hebrew fathers are not going to give their sons a name that sounds soft and effeminate. They are inferior. Yeah. So clearly, the Hebrew word Ezer does not mean inferior or subordinate. Mm-hmm. And the other word that is often used against women is weaker vessel in 1 Peter.
Yes,
for sure.
And it's important to recognize that it doesn't mean like weaker in character, weaker in intelligence. It means less power. All through the Old Testament, when God tells people to take care of the widows and orphans and the alien in your gates, it means people without power, without economic power, without political power, social power. And when Paul uses the word too in 1 Corinthians, he says, not many of you were noble, well-educated, high status, etc. He's using, and then he says, God chose the weak to shame the strong. He uses the word weak in the same way. Those without power, education, status, money, etc. Yeah. So the scripture does not use weaker vessel to mean, inherent a character flaw. Yeah. It means without power. And let's face it, most cultures, women have been without power. First of all, just physically, right? Men are stronger, bigger, faster. Testosterone does make them more aggressive, more risk-taking. And these are good. God made them that way. But it does mean that in most cultures, it's common for men to take advantage of that power. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then women are economically dependent. When women have children, most of them become economically dependent on someone to support them. So that's an economic loss of power. Yeah. So I think it's important for us to recognize that these are two words, sometimes it's easier to pin it on particular words. These are two words that we could help explain to people that the Bible is not against women, does not denigrate women. And in fact, it's realistic about their lack of power. But then how does it use that? It says, Christians, the church, men, their husbands, need to take care of them. That's their goal.
One of the things I really appreciate and found really fascinating in the book is how you use the terminology of script, secular script, for example. You use basically it's a terminology of this is a story that we're told about what it means to be a man. And here's where that story comes from. and kind of trace that genealogy. One of the stories, or one of the aspects of this secular script story, as you talk about it, is Darwinian theory, which you talk about in the book. Very, very interesting. This sort of naturalization or normalization of certain traits that are thought to be essential to the masculine condition. And so you get quotes like this. I just ran across this the other day. But this is a conservative commentator. This is Ben Shapiro. And you might agree with some of what he's saying, but then you can also hear some of the script coming through these beliefs. So he says, marriage is not about your personal sense of self-satisfaction. Marriage is supposed to be about building something together, a household. And that means that all your concerns are for the household. When a man goes out and earns, he's not going out and earning because he just feels like, I feel like going to work today. I feel like earning. The reality is that since time immemorial, here's the story. Since time immemorial, man's natural drive is to be peripatetic, to engage in short-term relations with women, to abandon those women, and then go and hunt and gather. But men subject themselves to the rhythms of women. Women have long-term rhythms, meaning they're the ones who have to carry and bear children, then care for those children. And so men trade away that freedom and independence for something higher, namely the ability to build a household with a woman. That is what they are doing, and that is a wonderful good. So it's interesting. You could agree with some of that, like, oh, yeah, this is wonderful good. But you can hear that story of like, this is against men's natural inclination. This is basically, you have to go contrary to your nature in order to be a man who's centered around his family.
Yes, I do take aim at that specific reasoning in my book. By the way, the guy he's getting that from is George Gilder. George Gilder wrote a very famous book. He's just quoting George Gilder there, who said, yeah.
That's why you're a professor.
That men's natural nature is to be barbarian, savage, love them and leave them, and that men have to go up against their nature. And I think that's extremely dangerous. If you tell men that marriage and family is against their nature, then they are going to abandon marriage and family. I mean, they are going to leave it behind. They are going to think, well, why should I do this? This is against my nature. And you'll find that on the manosphere, the right. Collection of men's groups on the manosphere. That notion is very, very common. Uh-huh. And so I take aim at that very carefully because it's not biblical. And it's let me start with the history. You mentioned the history, and then I'll get to Darwinism, because it's sometimes helpful to start with the colonial era, because the colonial era, as you know, was very Christian. And so we get to see sort of an outworking of what it looked like to have more of a Christian understanding of marriage and men. There were a lot of Puritans at that time. So it also is a time when before the Industrial Revolution, when men are working all day with their wives and children, right? They're in the family industry, the family farm, the family shop. A man is working with people he loves and has a moral bond with all day. So the expectation on men was much more geared toward caretaking and responsibility for those his family. The word authority even had a different definition. It meant you have responsibility for the common good. It had a very specific meaning. The common good of the marriage, the common good of the family, the common good of your church, your village. That's what authority meant. Didn't mean, you get to do what you want. Of course, these were tough guys too. They were making their way in a wilderness. So they had to have the more traditional male attributes like resilience and courage and mastery, because there were always new fields to plow, a new town to start, a new house to build, a new business to start. So it was an interesting mix of a very Christian understanding of caretaking, but also tough and resilient. How did we lose that? Mm-hmm. We lost it. We started with the Industrial Revolution. Because for the first time, what the Industrial Revolution did is take work out of the home, right? And men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And you actually see this in the literature of the time. People began to complain that men's character was changing. because now instead of working with people they loved and were responsible for, so they knew they had to be gentle, they had to be caring. Now they're working as an individual in competition with other men. And it seemed almost necessary to be more aggressive, assertive, egocentric, look out for number one, selfish ambition, to use a word that's used a lot in the New Testament. Galatians says, selfish ambition is one of the things we need to leave behind. But ambition and self-seeking became much more common, and people protested it. Already in the 19th century, you see people writing that our men are changing. They're losing their Christian character. I quote a letter to the editor, for example, that said, men are making success, financial, monetary success has become their idol. In gaining the world, they're losing their soul. And so that's when you actually see the turning point, as people began to say, men are losing their sense of morality. And of course, as work left the home, as people began to build factories and offices and big universities and banking, and a whole large public realm developed, and people began to say, well, this area should be run by scientific management principles, by which they meant value free. You don't bring your personal values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today, right? And so as men were more and more exposed to secular education, worked in a secularized workplace, men did begin to lose the biblical concept of masculinity. And I go through several stages, and you mentioned Darwinism. Yeah, so Darwinism, it was popularized here in the States by Herbert Spencer, who wrote that the men who win out in the struggle for existence are going to be tough, rude, crude, predatory, savage, barbarian, brutal. And, these are our ancestors. So this is our true nature. Ever since the ancient Greeks, people had said, oh, no, our true nature is a spiritual, moral nature, and our spiritual nature should govern our animal impulses and instincts. And now there was a complete flip. People began to say, no, our true nature is our animal nature, the biological impulses for domination and power, and covered by a thin veneer of civilization. That was one of their favorite words, a thin veneer of civilization, but our true self is wild, savage, barbarian. By the way, you might ask, well, how would women put up with such brutal men? And Spencer said, well, it would help if they developed the ability to please. And then he added, it would also be good if they learned how to hide their resentment at such poor treatment.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So they message from evolution. And by the way, Darwin said some things too, just not as extreme, but Darwin himself said women are inferior to men. Very clearly stated that intellectually in every way they're inferior to men. And then he said, oh yes, they are more intuitive, they're more sensitive. He said, but those are traits of the lower species. So even our strengths were signs of our inferiority.
Wow.
So the impact of Darwinism has been extremely negative and has contributed a lot to the secular definition of manhood.
Mm-hmm.
That's really fascinating. It's really fascinating how that really put an enormous amount of pressure on women to basically be these moral civilizing centers of society, as you write in the book.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, too. Yes, if the public sphere was supposed to be value-free, then where would values be cultivated? Because people didn't just want to give up on sacrifice, altruism, love, religious devotion, and so on. Well, those belonged in the home now, in the private sphere, home and church. And who would be responsible for cultivating them? Well, women, because women were still at home at the time. And so for the first time ever in human history, women were said to be morally superior to men. This was brand new. We're so used to the double standard. We kind of think this is natural.
Right.
It's not.
Yeah.
No, again, back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people thought the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight. And they thought men were more rational. Therefore, men were more moral. They were morally stronger.
Right.
They had to keep women in line because they were the stronger one. And so this was a dramatic turnaround when in the 19th century, people began to hold up women as morally superior and give women the role of being the moral guardians of society. And you're right, there was a lot of pressure then on women. If their husbands were coming home after working all day in the dog-eat-dog, competitive, amoral world of commerce and politics, and then they came home, they were supposed to be reformed and refined by their morally superior wives. And this is also why women led a lot of the reform movements, because of urbanization and industrialization. There were a lot of social problems, especially young men. Young men were coming in from the countryside where they were being separated from normal structures of accountability, like the family, a church, the village. And so they were falling prey to the vices more common in the city. Gambling increased, drinking increased, the number of brothels mushroomed, prostitution went way up. Sex trafficking, some of the things we're dealing with again today. And it was mostly women who led the reform movements, the abolition movement against slavery, the temperance movement, movements against prostitution and trafficking, and so on, were mostly led by women. Well, that created a lot of tension between men and women as well, because essentially the script, I'm glad you used that word, the script was, well, men can be irresponsible and alcoholics and sexually irresponsible because that's their true nature, as Ben Shapiro put it, their true nature. And then it's up to women to tame them, to bring them back in line. So that language,
We've even
Go
heard
ahead.
fairly recently, comments, again, from kind of the conservative world to the effect that women should thank their husbands for not cheating on them.
Mm-hmm.
Because men are acting so much contrary to their John Gilder or George Gilder, their nature, that women should basically be saying, thank you for not cheating on me.
Yeah, I know. Dennis Prager, I watched a video of him, and he was saying that, like, he was encouraging us as women, if our husbands are still with us. And so that we should thank our husbands for not cheating. So I went to Dave and I was like, do you want me to thank you for not, like, I was so confused. And he was like, that's crazy.
Well, this contributes, like what you're saying, this thin veneer of civilization that men are going to break out over the slightest crack in that thin veneer of civilization, that we're just these animals that have no control but for women keeping us in line or something like that. And you see this in the church all over the place too, porn addictions and stuff. It's like men are treated like, oh, they're just going to do that, and you need to like really tamp down on it, because our essential nature is breaking free, going out, like bucking all the rules. And women are naturally, I guess, more civilized or something like that. And so this creates all this confusion, and we're internalizing this script of what it means to be a man. So we actually treat ourselves as weaker. We're treating ourselves as monsters waiting to bust the boundaries.
Yeah, as one historian I read put it this way, we're letting men off the hook.
Yeah.
This script lets men off the hook because it says, well, that's their nature. By the way, one thing we haven't talked about is fathers, because that played into this as well. Today we know that fathers are mocked and ridiculed in the media, and 40% of children in the U.S. live apart from their natural fathers. We have the highest rate of single parenthood in the world. And when did that start? Again, it was the Industrial Revolution, because the first time boys were growing up without day-to-day contact with their fathers. Their fathers were not the ones teaching them and training them in adult skills. And they found themselves with a lot of free time, unsupervised, sort of the Tom Sawyer image. And the leading psychologist of the day said this, the 19th century, said this, never before in American history have boys been so wild. Never before have they been so half-orphaned and left up to female governance in the home, the school, the church. Yeah. Half-orphaned. Isn't that amazing? And that's when they became wild. He said they've never been wild like this before. And when fathers were in the home, boys weren't like this. And so historians actually call it boy culture. The idea that to be a real boy, was to be a Tom Sawyer, a Huck Finn. That's when those books were written, by the way. Specifically, it was a new genre of books called bad boy books. Portraying the real boy as the guy who's kind of rude and rebellious and rambunctious. And they brought that into adulthood with them then, right? What did they do with boy culture? So that's another source of what you're talking about, boys will be boys. It's because they were being raised without their fathers for the first time in American history. And of course, what structure they did get was from women, mothers, female teachers. Right. So of course they were not going to give in to those moral rules, because then morality seemed effeminate. Yeah. Morality seemed to be giving into women. Well, no man's going to do that. And so, morality has to be redefined as something that's truly masculine, that it is male to be a moral leader. In my book, I take people back again and again to the cultural mandate. The cultural mandate tells us how God originally created men. They weren't originally the wild beast, evolving from the apes. Originally, what does Genesis say? He made them in his image, male and female in his image, to do what? To be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and then to have dominion over the earth. So the first part doesn't just mean have families, but it means all the social institutions, because they all grow out of the family. The family becomes a clan, becomes a village. They start a school, they start a government, they have a church. All the they have a marketplace, economics. All the social institutions grow originally out of the family. So the cultural mandate is saying it's up to men and women, but here we're talking about men, that they find their true fulfillment not in breaking free from civilization, but by building the social institutions. And then dominion over the earth means harness the natural resources. So it's all the arts and sciences. It's not just planting crops, being a farmer, but anything you do to have dominion over nature. So it's building bridges and buildings, it's coding computers, it's composing music. One of my students said, "What do you mean composing music?" I said, "Well, I play the violin." I said, what's the violin made out of? Wood. And what's the bow made out of? Horsehair. So all the transcendent beauty we associate with music starts with the raw materials of nature. And so to counter that notion that there's only a thin veneer of civilization and men find their true nature breaking free and becoming wild, which was a big theme in the late 19th century, I keep bringing us back. No, God made us to create civilizations, to create cultures, to create history. This is their true nature. This is not women imposing their expectations on men. This is what men were created to do. And we have to make sure we have a very strong message in the church that this is men's true, inherent, original nature.
Mm-hmm. As we wrap it up here, as someone reads your book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, what do you hope that they will gain, when they finish?
Well, in a very short phrase, a biblical view of masculinity, a God-centered view of masculinity. And to break that down a little, to help them be encouraged by the sociological data that we cited, that men are doing a good job, that men who do follow God's way are testing out as extremely loving, engaged husbands and fathers. Mm-hmm. Like I said, it's hidden away in the academic literature, so we need to bring that out. And as an encouragement, because men are being beaten down so much. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." Okay. Okay, so I want to address that. But then I want people to tell people see where, I loved what you were saying, Dave, where I think a lot of Christian men, as they kind of reach out for something better, what do? They pick up on whatever's in our culture. And our culture has a lot of secular ideas of masculinity that I see people who are trying to sort of recover their masculinity usually end up taking that late 19th century view of men are naturally wild and barbarian and savage, and this is their true nature, and this is what they need to reconnect with. They need to go out in the wild and climb mountains and hunt elk, and and so I also want to counter that by helping them to see, no, that's a secular script. The Christian script has to come back to the cultural mandate. All humans, but men's original nature was not to escape from civilization, but to build civilizations, to be an integral part of their family. They don't find their true nature by escaping off into the woods. And by the way, that it's not just Darwinism, though that was a big part of it. There was actually a literary genre called literary naturalism, which built consciously a Darwinian message into their novels. The best known is Jack London. Jack London read Darwin as a young adult and had what one historian calls a conversion experience to radical materialism. And he actually memorized passages from Darwin and could repeat them by heart, the way Christians memorize scripture. Yeah. So he wrote about dogs, remember Call of the Wild, but they were metaphors for humans. And his point was that humans are just products of evolution, genes in the environment. And a short story that I mentioned in the book is a short story called The Law of Life. The Law of Life, where a nomadic Eskimo tribe leaves the grandfather behind to die in the snow. And of course, it's told from the grandfather's perspective. So of course he's like thinking, I'm about to die and I'm about to freeze to death. My family's left me behind. And then he says, well, isn't this a Darwinian view anyway? Once you've fulfilled the reproductive imperative, like your only job as an individual, biologically speaking, is to reproduce so the next generation can survive. After that, what does it matter? What does it matter? And so the wolves, by the way, are closing in to devour him. And that's how the story ends. But then he says, is it not the law of life? That once you've fulfilled your biology, what use are you? So there was a literary movement as well that pounded these themes home, and that with the hero, was often a frontiersman, a mountain man, a hunter, a trapper, a scout, because the message was, this is how you find your true manhood, is escaping from civilization, escaping from marriage, escaping from the impact of women, so that you can find your true masculine nature. And that, unfortunately, is what, Dave, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of Christian men are sort of picking up on that message. So it's important that I heard a commentator the other day say, we don't want to be the macho jerk or the wimpy new age. We got those. Those are the two secular options for us. So it's very important that we go back to scripture and really work out, a biblical view of masculinity.
Which is exactly what your book does for us. So we want everyone to grab a copy of The Toxic War on Masculinity. And we've had you on the Girl Defined show before. We talked all about Love Thy Body, which is amazing. And I'll link that episode so they can go back and listen to that one as well. But Nancy, how can they connect with you? How can they grab your book? Because I know this conversation has just left them wanting more from you.
Can I show the book?
Yes, you can.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I have a new website, so I need to give you that address, nancypearcey.com.
Great.
Straightforward. You can order books from the website, or if you want, you can go to Amazon itself.
Thank you, Nancy, so much for taking the time to be with us. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
I have really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate hearing your perspective on these issues.